really quite massive class nerfs on the pre-patch. And there's very interesting situations like I've seen numbers that do not show that marksmanship is in a good place right now.
It's not.
But overall, basically, the balance is kind of up shit creek right now. Which is I think it's kind of common for that sort of thing to happen in pre-patches.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
It makes sense.
Yeah, especially when half the Shadowlands systems are working, but the other half aren't working, right? So, all just a big mess.
Yeah, that's the thing that I think people kind of... It's weird because, yes, pre-patch doesn't matter and things are different. However, it's not just, all the numbers are wrong in pre-patch. It's a lot of the numbers are what they will be, but, add a couple talent points, add extra gear, they will be the same roughly scaled up. So that's where you have to look, I guess, individually at, hey, this is actually... Is this unbalanced because it's pre-patch? Or is this unbalanced also it's pre-patch, which makes it slightly worse? And that's where the hunter numbers look at the minute. Because I saw, I can't remember who it was. Someone gave some rationale, and I was just like, no, this is not pre-patch bullshit. These numbers are bigger than they should be because of pre-patch bullshit. Once pre-patch bullshit goes away, they will be even lower. So they definitely need hopefully they have a big balance pass ready for Dragonflight. I hope. Otherwise, we'll need a big pass for Dragonflight and then a big pass for raid release. Otherwise, it's just going to be sorry, you picked the wrong spec this time again, loser. But
yeah, and if they let that happen, that will be awful for the narrative. And the narrative is bloody important, right? You can't lose the narrative because then, you just can't influence your community anymore, right? If you're in a position like Blizzard. So they can't let, they can't let balance be scuffed to the point where that is the solidified opinion in the community. Because that's 2 weeks of damage that'll ripple on for months.
That's the hateful thing. It's never about reality. It's always with that perception.
Exactly.
And they lose it every single time.
Yeah.
Every single time. And I mean, they've even... This is a problem. Even pre-patch, you'll have lost it. Because that's the thing, right? Say you're putting together class content. Say you're putting together, what should you play in Dragonflight? Or here's how they're looking design-wise. You obviously have to talk a little bit about how they're literally doing. Because that's what influences people's decisions, right? Mm-hmm. You don't just say, tier list, I will... as an example for me, Elemental Shaman's really, really fun. There's loads of really cool design elements in that. The Electrified Shock stuff where you have a couple, or the Surge of Power and Electrified Shocks, you've got a window of extra chain lightning damage and lightning damage. That's really cool. But if Enhancement Shaman were at the bottom of the list, I think they're reasonably close to that in terms of raid damage.
Oh no.
Then you do have to say, you'll have all the fun in the world, but a large part of having fun in World of Warcraft is, unfortunately, you being at the top of the damage meter. Yeah,
so the worry is that all this design work happens, but just loads of the cool shit is essentially dead.
Yeah.
I think we're all okay with maybe a few % of variation either way, but if it feels like it's 20%, 15%, then people start to feel like they no longer have options and they have to do the thing that's ideal. That'll be, that'll be their challenge. Definitely quite a big one, considering they are kind of overhauling how a lot of the game works right now.
It's the same with the utility question, right? Where you go, okay, well, utility isn't damage numbers. People look at damage numbers for balance, but utility is part of it. And in FF14, they get away with that because the utility is raid buffs, which means more damage.
Yeah.
But it's like, hey, you've got, say, Warlocks, you've got Demonic Gateway. How do you put Demonic Gateway in as a, how do you say, okay, well, let's take 0.5% off Warlock damage to make up for Demonic Gateway? That only makes sense when you're using Demonic Gateway.
Yeah.
But if you don't, well, there you go. And that's the thing. World of Warcraft is too complicated from the balance correctly, including all utility. I just end up well, please just try to make all the damage numbers flat and see what happens, I guess. But clearly they struggle to do that for whatever reason.
Yeah, World of Warcraft's a bit of a nightmare. And it's almost like the nature of the beast, right? Getting all this shit right.
Yep.
Because you end up in this situation where it always pushes towards things being homogenized, right? That's always the way that it kind of ends up going. And Blizzard keep on trying to, because we all remember bring the player, not the class. At least I do, because that line of thought was coming in. I was basically there when it was coming in, right? Years and years and years and years ago. And now they've changed a little bit. They do want the classes to feel differentiated from each other.
Yeah,
in a game where it's so much about the numbers, how do you really do hybrid utility?
Yeah, it's like Ian talking about game 1 versus game 2.
Yeah.
And it's like you have to balance the reality of, power infusing someone because it's going to be the best time to power infuse them is at this break point to burst this boss at this window. That's a great decision. But in a multiplayer game, the incentives are all over the place for different players. And that's the problem with a multiplayer game. You have multiple players in it. You can't just go, oh, what's this player doing? Oh, yeah. Here's really interesting choices for this player to make. And that's how they sometimes design, assuming all the players in like a group are one solitary unit. And this is a unit of players that's got a challenge of beating the boss. And that's really cool. But then you go into a pub or you go into a guild where people aren't best friends or whatever else. And they're there to get the parse. Oh, okay. Well, is parsing gameplay? Yes, unfortunately. It's, what's the term? It's emergent gameplay that comes out of the social systems and dynamics in MMO as opposed to design gameplay. But it is how it is.
Yeah.
It is how it is.
Yeah, and like in FF14, they've handled that in a funny way where the devs have constantly said, if you ever are seen to use a DPS meter and then communicate to other players about it in a way that's disparaging against them, you're banned. Right? So it's like that all like totally exists in FF14, but it's way more pushed underground in a way because it's literally a bannable offense to talk about it in chat.
Yeah, which means you've got all this like kind of weird toxicity that bubbles under the surface sometimes. And
Yeah,
that gets
yeah.
weird. And it's even the same with like Kira, who runs the FF logs and Warcraft logs, talking about, the whole thing with the machinist things, the whole machinist damage problem.
Yeah.
Then talking about A, DPS, RDPS, and NDPS. You're like, oh, okay, so it's literally which metric this website uses by default for when you click the page suddenly is like a whole thing of this could impact the game's entire balance in terms of how people discuss it later on. Because people always talk about, RDPS and go versus ADPS. You're like, okay, rate DPS. It's like rate adjusted APS or DPS versus actual DPS. And rate adjusted includes the amount you've gave through buffs and stuff. And that's always lower for machinists. You're like, oh, well, if you just use a different metric, then that is how things will be managed differently.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, okay, this is very complicated.
And then the way that all that
complicated.
trickles down into the community is always fascinating.
Yep.
Because there's a lot of times where like you can even literally look at raid logs and you'll see that, let's just say there's the flavor of the month class, but that's the flavor of the month can produce incredible numbers, but those numbers are being created by people with completely optimized stats who are playing perfectly, who also have the best trinkets for that build, right? So then you end up in a situation where, okay, but you're not that person who plays the game like 40 hours a week and is absolutely incredible. So would you rather be in the lower quartile of the flavor of the month spec or the upper quartile of a spec that you actually enjoy playing? The latter may feel like the wrong option, but you'll probably do better with it. And the same almost even applies to talent choices, right? Like, it obviously depends on balance, but there's totally a world where, with, say, how Blood Talons used to be when it was all, like, super complex, where the guides would be like, yeah, use Blood Talons. It's the best. It'll do the most damage. I wonder how many people would then go and use Blood Talons and not actually be good enough that if they used another talent, they'd, it would be more simple and they would do better.
Yeah.
So it's all these interesting things where, yeah, you kind of have like the reality that forms from the community discussions and how that kind of differs from aspects of the game in an interesting way. I imagine this is the sort of thing the class team think about a hell of a lot.
Yeah, like Blood Talons has the alternative choice node, Lion Strength, which then gives you, I think it's 25% increase on your next two Ferocious Bites or Rips. Then Lion Strength is just flat 50% to 15%, all of them. So then you go, okay, well, am I going to get all of my Ferocious Bites and Rips Blood Talons because I'm actively on top of using it? Okay, no, then I'll take Lion Strength, theoretically. But then Blood Talons has become a little bit easier with Lunar Inspiration. You're like, okay, well then I guess you just kind of make it a bit weird. Then it's kind of, how do you balance that? Is it 10% difference? What's that overall damage? Is that overall 5% damage? Is that 10% damage? I have no idea. Same with the Destruction Warlock having the option to not have Havoc.
Yes.
So you have Havoc, which is I was going to say you press Q because that's my keybind for it. That doesn't make sense. You press Havoc, and then anytime you send a single target spell at another target, it's duplicated Havoc. Or you pick Mayhem, which means anytime you use a single target spell, Havoc is applied randomly for a lesser duration to a random target nearby. And that's like, okay, well, here's a version that's weaker because you don't have to use it. The skill ceiling is lower, but your damage output is lower. And I go, well, how do you balance that? Do you balance it in a way it's actually close enough, or do you balance it further away? And you kind of go, that's a really difficult philosophical question because of how the game works. Someone, you join a group and someone sees you have that and go, that's not optimal. And then you have to say, well, actually for me, considering I always forget to press Havoc, it's actually better for me. And that's like the whole thing that goes wrong. But there was another part of that I thought
these are things that won't appear in Sims.
Yeah.
Which is big.
Yeah, not that Sims are even working a lot of the time now at the minute.
True.
A lot of the ACLs aren't done yet. But there was an example I wanted to use that I thought was interesting. And I think it is, it's what I was thinking recently was Wowhead for their DPS ranking. They use 95th percentile on Mythic for a lot of their like DPS comparisons. And that's because that kind of article is probably weighted towards Mythic players.
Yeah.
But then people who aren't Mythic players will read it and go, oh, well, this is good, this is bad. And then you look at like the heroic across all percentiles, and it's very different.
I love doing that.
Yeah, and you kind of go,
people don't think about that. Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You go, oh well, how do you do this? And the only correct answer, I think, is that, and it's an unreasonable one, is that you go, okay, well, Wowhead now do 5 articles instead of 1. And you're like, well, that's a lot of work to get all the different perspectives. You're like, that's the problem with data. You can read them from different perspectives. I go, oh shit, okay. Well, how does this actually fare out then?
Oh, I know there's a really good phrase. The point of the phrase is that statistics can be fucking used in very interesting ways, but I've totally forgotten the phrase. Anyway, right, class stuff, a whole big wave of tuning. We'll have to see where things land. Certainly, I do expect turbulence. Definitely expect turbulence on this one. I think that for most players, it won't matter humongously, but if they end up in a situation where, like, let's just say Ret Paladin's dead and Hunters are dead, like, that will be a large problem. So they have to ensure those things don't happen. But, just given the scope of the changes and how, like, they're going to get this one over the finish line, I don't think they're going to do so very comfortably. I do just think, bit of turbulence.